In this tutorial I want to talk about managing libraries and default content, and this first part of the movie will just talk about just give an overview of it. You'll find that I will make this into a single movie, but you'll be able to scroll through the movie and see specific sections, and this number and word here will change. So you'll be able to scrub through the movie and just stop it at the headings that you can see, and then just play those parts. Let's begin by switching to a layer that has nothing on it. I'm just going to take the rectangle tool and talk a little bit about what default content is. Essentially, you are able to control what resources appear in various parts of the program when you open it up. And by resources I mean things like hatches, image fills, textures, plants, wall styles, slab styles, all of that kind of stuff. You can control what appears in the various lists in Vectorworks, and you can limit the availability of certain of these resources. So if we look here, and we've just drawn a rectangle here that has a white fill. Let's just look at the fills, for example, and if we come in here and click on this little icon up here, you'll see that the library, the default content library, contains Colorbond, Dulux, Cabots, Murabond, Porter's Paints, and so on. So these are all part of the default content library. Also the AS 1100-301 material colors, for example. So all of these things are available as part of the default content that comes with the version of Vectorworks that you've purchased. So this is a fill. Let's take a look at a hatch, for example. So the default content for hatches is a file that contains all of these hatches. Now you can edit this and take ones out, add other ones, add other files, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Just some other examples. For example, there are tile fills. Again, there's a whole bunch of these that are in default content. All of these you can localize or customize, I should say. And there are also gradients, and there are also image fills. Now, I mentioned plants. If we take the plant tool, the default content for plants has this selection of plants in it. The default content for walls has all of the Australian wall styles in it. And all of these lists can be customized by the user, because no one's going to use all of these wall styles, for example, so you might want to go in there and just take out the ones that you don't use. And this is there's some context to this as well, because there are separate locations for the hatches that are used in walls as opposed to the hatches that might just get used in your drawing. So for example, if we look at this hatch library here, these are not hatches that you necessarily want to see on a floor plan in a wall. So there's a separate place for things like wall hatches and some of the other parts that you'll see in the program. Another example of default content, if I switch to a right ISO view and I was to extrude this to say 3 meters, and we go to the render tab, if you had Renderworks, you'll see that there's also a group of default textures in the program. So this is all part of the default content. And to see the default content that has been loaded with Vectorworks, you must have a particular preference turned on. And if we go to the Tools menu, down to Options, Vectorworks Preferences, the one that you need to have on is in the Session tab, and it's called Display Default Content. That should be on by default anyway. But if you have this off, then you won't see any of the default content. There's also default content in WinDAW and in the VAA title blocks and things like that as well in the existing tree tool. So that's a quick rundown of what default content can do for you. Now let's talk about where the default content is stored. There's really three places it can be stored, and I'm going to talk about two of them here. Let's look at the Mac to begin with. In your Vectorworks 2011 folder, and you can see that here, which is in the Mac HD Applications Vectorworks 2011. In there's a folder called Libraries, then there's Defaults, and I've just opened one up here as an example, Attribute Hatches and Default ANZ. Now these hatches here are the ones that are populating this list here. Okay, so again, here's the application folder, and we've in Defaults, Attribute Hatches, and that's the hatch file there. If you put any more files containing hatches in this folder, then those will also appear in the list here. If you remove any hatches, then you'll remove them from the list, any hatches from this file. You'll see that there's also attributes for image fills, tile fills, all sorts of things in the list here, plants and textures and so on. So this is where you store or where the default ones are stored, and by editing any of these libraries in here you can change what will appear in Vectorworks. Now if you customize any of these libraries, then you can also save those into a particular location. Let me just run through the Windows version of that. So in Windows we're talking about in Program Files, Vectorworks 2011, Libraries, Defaults, Attributes, Hatches. So here's the file path here, Vectorworks, Libraries, Default, Attributes, Hatches, and here's that exact same file I was just referring to. In other words, the file that is causing all of these hatches to appear in this position. And again, adding more files in here or editing this file, you can control what appears in that list. Now if you do want to add additional files, it's a good idea to actually not put them in the application folder in case for whatever reason you reinstall Vectorworks and you don't normally back up the files in the applications folder. So there's a special user folder where you can put files that the user has created. Let's have a look at the location for both of these on Macintosh and Windows. Firstly on Macintosh, and the Macintosh user library for Vectorworks, and this is the default location, but you can change this location to any convenient folder you like on your computer. The default one is Users, your login name, Library, Application Support, Vectorworks 2011, and then once you get to this point here, the library structure is almost identical to the library structure that you see in the Vectorworks folder. Now in my attributes hatches here, I don't have any files in my user folder, but if I had some custom hatches that I had developed and I put them in here, then they will appear in the hatch in this list in Vectorworks. And again, looking at this location on Windows, you'll see here that we have the same folder structure. It's in a different location on Windows. This is the C drive, Users, Administrator, App Data, Roaming, Nemetschek, Vectorworks 2011, Libraries, Defaults, and that gets us to the same place that we were just talking about on the Mac. Now some of these folders in this folder path are hidden, so you can't necessarily navigate to them unless you are showing hidden folders. But in either case, by far the quickest way to get to this location is to go to Vectorworks Preferences. So let's go to Options, Vectorworks Preferences, and here you'll see there's a tab called User Folders, and here's that file path that we were just looking at on the Mac, and it's a similar one on Windows. So if you want to open this particular location, then all you need to do, or the folder in this location, is to click Reveal in Finder on a Mac or Explore on Windows. And if you do that, it will actually open this folder location, and you'll be able to see where it is on your computer. If you want to customize that location, then you can click this Choose button here, and that will allow you to choose a different default library application. Now, also stored in this place are custom workspaces and a few other things like template files and standards files and things like that. So this way you're able to create content and put it in a place that's not going to get overwritten if you reinstall Vectorworks, and this would normally also be a place that is backed up on your computer. So any special content that you create, it's going to get backed up because it's not in the application folder and it's in a place on your hard drive that should be backed up. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about user folders. And just to reiterate, going to the Tools menu, down to Vectorworks Preferences, clicking on User Folders, and then either Explore or Reveal in Finder will take you to your user folder. And this is where you store any content that you create. You'll notice this is where there's a Workspaces folder here. Any custom workspaces that you create will get saved into that Workspaces folder. So what we're going to do is to demonstrate how this works, and I'm going to create a Vectorworks file and put it in this folder here called Attributes Hatches, and then we're going to see how that will then appear in our hatch list. So we'll go back to Vectorworks and we'll just cancel out of that, and let's go ahead and create a new document. And in this document I'm going to create a hatch, and we do that using the resource browser, and I can click on resources and go new resource and choose hatch. That's just off the screen there. Alright, I'm going to call this a hatch, and this will make it appear at the top of an alphabetical list. Let's just make some random changes here so that we can identify this hatch. Black lines and maybe a yellow fill like that, and there's the hatch that we have in this file. Alright, so we'll now go ahead and do a save as on this file, and we'll call this my hatches, and I'm already located in the folder we need to save this onto. So there's the file path. You might find it easier actually to save these files out onto the desktop and then just drag them into the user folder. It's up to you. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now, to have any hatches that I create in this file appear in the list here, I need to restart Vectorworks. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Now, in the normal course of work, you will create new resources in files that you're currently working on. So you might be working away one day and suddenly decide that you need a new hatch, or you need a new image fill, or you need a new texture, or a plant, or whatever. Or a symbol. Once you have created a resource in an existing document, you don't need to open your default content file and copy and paste into your default content file. You can simply export from the drawing you're working in and put it into the default content. Let me explain that a little bit better. I'll start by creating a blank drawing again, and let's say I've been working away in this file and I needed to create a new hatch, and let's go ahead and do that in this file. And so I'll click this little home button here, which will make this change to Untitled 2, which is our currently open document, and show that I have nothing in this file. So let's go ahead and create another hatch in this file. So we'll go in here and actually we'll go up here, new resource, and call it choose hatch, and we'll call this another hatch, and again we'll just make some fairly random changes here. This one we'll give a blue fill to, and alright, so I've created this new hatch and I'd like to save this back into my default content file. So you might think, well, I need to open the file and copy it in. Well, you don't need to do that. All you need to do once you've created this is to find it in the resource browser here, right click on it, and you'll see there's an option here that says export, and you choose export and you'll get a list of recent exported files. That's not really what we want. We've got a library user folder, and looking down here, there's the file we created a few minutes ago, and that's where we want to export this resource to. So if we just click OK, then that's done. This hatch is now in my default content, and it will be available in any other Vectorworks drawing that I create. So here it is in this drawing, but let's close this drawing down and open a new one, and I'll draw a rectangle, and let's look at our hatches in here, and you'll see that this is now already in our list here, ready for me to choose. So what this allows you to do, once you set up those library files, you're able to add the default content as you develop it and go along, because you won't be able to develop all your default content initially up front. And so what you can do is to develop that over time, and anytime you do create a resource and you go, yeah, that's something I can reuse, you just use that export function, and it's in the default content, and you can build up a library fairly quickly like that. So I just want to talk a little bit now about how you can remove some of the default files, because obviously you probably don't necessarily want everything that's in the default content to be appearing in your lists. Let's go out to the Mac Finder, and just to reinforce where we are, I'm currently in the Applications folder. The equivalent place on this would be Program Files on Windows, and in the Vectorworks folder. So here are the folders in the Vectorworks folder, and again we're interested in libraries and defaults. So if I were to take this hatches file out of here, and I'll do that, I'll just move it from this attributes hatches up and just put it out here at the defaults level, so it's still there but it's not going to be appearing in Vectorworks. I can just literally take this up here and put it into defaults, and you'll see it's now appearing in just down here, so it's been taken out of that folder there. And let's do the same thing for some of the wall styles. If we go to wall slabs down here, you'll see we've got a bunch of styles here, and you might say, look, I actually don't ever use autoclaved aerated concrete, I don't use brick veneer, I don't use sandwich panels, and I don't use steel studs, so I'd like them removed from the list of wall styles. So let's do that with these as well, and again I'll just drag this up here and put that up one level, so you'll see that they'll just all be appearing there now outside the folder. And note that anytime you do add or remove a file from the default content system, a file I'm talking about instead of just a resource using export, then you do need to restart Vectorworks for those changes to take into effect, or to come into effect. Now I have done that, so I'll now switch back to Vectorworks, and if we take the wall tool and we look at the list here now, you'll see that this list is actually quite a bit shorter. It doesn't have the aerated concrete, it doesn't have the steel studs, and so on. If we look at the hatch list, you'll see that we only have the hatches now. I'll move this up a little bit. We only have the hatches now from this file or from default content. So the other ones that we've taken out are not there. So this is how you can control what appears in the various default content lists, and also build up your resource libraries. Now, the last part of this movie I will talk about managing the default content for larger firms where they want to put resources on a server. So if you're only just a single user, you don't need to watch any more of this particular movie. The final thing I wanted to talk about in this movie is when you want to centralize resources or content for larger offices. And what we've been talking about so far is not that different to what you have to do. There's one additional step, and that is accessed through Vectorworks Preferences. So if we go back up to Options, Vectorworks Preferences, and switch to User Folders, you'll notice at the bottom here there is a Workgroup and Project Folders section. So what you can do is to create the library files on the server in a folder that you nominate in this by clicking this Add button here. So you would click Add and then navigate to your server, and do that on all of the computers that you wanted to access the default content from. And that way you're able to have everybody accessing the same default content and only have it stored in one location. People can still export resources to there if they have that level of permission to save files to the server, and otherwise it will work in exactly the same way. Now I'll just go back out to the Finder and just mention a couple of things about managing files on the server. So the folder structure that you would need to create, actually let's just go Reveal in Finder and we'll go back to our default content here. Alright, so at this level here, this is where you would create a folder. So let's say your firm is Acme Architects, then you would have a folder called Acme Architects library, Vectorworks library files here, and in that folder you need to have the identical folder structure that we're seeing here. Now generally speaking, the only thing that you want to control is libraries and defaults and possibly favorite files. These are like aliases or shortcuts that you can put in here to library files that you want to appear in the resource browser. The other one you might want to put on the server is the plant database, and again that would allow everyone to access the same plant database. The workspaces are individual, they need to stay on the local machine, and probably the other things here need to stay on the local machine. So it's really only this folder here that you need to replicate on the server. And once you do that, you can then put in here in exactly the same way that we've described any files that you want to appear to or to be usable to everyone in your office. Now once you do that, it's important that you don't replicate those files on the user machines as well. So typically what I would recommend is that you remove the libraries folder from each of the users machines and only have the libraries folder on the server. Now Vectorworks will recreate an empty libraries folder in the user folder if you do that, but that way you'll guarantee that there are no files in there. Now the only reservation about doing this is if people are working on laptops that are not connected to the server, because obviously if they're accessing libraries from the server and their laptop doesn't have access to the server at some point in time, then they're not going to have those libraries available. In that scenario, it is possible that you might want to replicate some of the libraries on the laptop machine, so that when the laptop is away from the office, there's still access to some of the libraries.